So thank you so much for all attending this session on promoting healthy relationships among youth through healthy marriage and relationship education. And thanks as well to those of you that are joining us by live stream. We're glad to have all of you with us today. My name is Samantha Illangasekare. I am the team lead for healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood research at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families. And I'm really excited to be with you here today to moderate this session. Since the mid-2000s, ACF's Office of Family Assistance has funded grants to provide comprehensive healthy marriage and relationship education, or HMRE, services to support the formation and maintenance of two-parent families with the ultimate goal of promoting child and family well-being. Among those served by these federally funded HMRE programs are youth and young adults. In fact, approximately 2/3 of the current healthy marriage grantees now are providing healthy marriage and relationship education to youth or young adults ages 14 to 24. However, we know that the majority of the existing body of HMRE research has typically focused on programs for adults, and specifically adult couples. So in this session today, we'll hear about 3 research projects that are contributing to a growing and needed body of research on HMRE programs for youth and young adults. The 3 presentations will help us understand who these HMRE programs are serving, how they're implemented, and how they might be strengthened. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel of fantastic speakers today. I think we're gonna, we're good. Okay, I wasn't sure if we were gonna switch up the order, but we're gonna go with what we planned. So we'll first hear from Mindy Scott. Dr. Scott is a senior research scientist at Child Trends. She's involved in a number of research and evaluation projects focusing on healthy marriage, responsible fatherhood, and teen pregnancy prevention. She's conducted research on adolescent and young adult relationships, the association between adolescent risky sexual behaviors and young adult reproductive health outcomes, and healthy marriage and relationship education for teens and young adults. Next, we'll hear from Julia Alamillo. Dr. Alamillo is a human services researcher at Mathematica Policy Research with expertise in quantitative and qualitative data analysis and evaluation technical assistance. Her work focuses on family support programs, including healthy marriage and relationship education for youth, adolescent pregnancy prevention, and responsible fatherhood. She's involved in several ACF projects, including the Strengthening Relationship Education and Marriage Services, or STREAMS evaluation, which you will hear more about today, and the Parents and Children Together evaluation, which you will learn about if you attend or live stream tomorrow's plenary. So we hope to see you all there as well. Finally, we'll hear from Diane Paulsell. She's a director in Mathematica's Human Services Division and has more than 20 years of experience conducting research on the effects of early childhood education and family support programs and policy on low-income families and children. And her areas of expertise and research include home visiting, home-based childcare, early childhood systems, family support, and implementation science. She is the co-product director of the STREAMS evaluation and the principal investigator for the SARM project, which you will hear her speak about today. And before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we will have time at the end of the presentations for questions, both from here in the room and via live stream. So please go ahead and jot those down and save them until the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mindy Scott.
Thanks, Sam, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mindy Scott from Child Trends, and I'm going to be presenting results from a study that we recently completed with OPRE, which looked at federally funded healthy marriage and relationship education programs for youth. And I just want to start with a little bit of background for the motivation for that study. And also, I think it helps to frame the topic for today's session a bit more broadly. And Sam already gave some of this in her opening remarks. So this all kind of starts with the idea that research finds that romantic relationships during adolescence are developmentally appropriate and have the potential to shape a variety of experiences during adolescence and also beyond. So thinking about experiences with relationships in young adulthood and even into adulthood. These experiences can be both positive and negative, depending on the nature and quality of youth romantic relationships. And healthy marriage and relationship education, or HMRE programming, is designed to support youth as they navigate these relationships. These programs can help youth improve their attitudes and knowledge and expectations about romantic relationships, and also help them develop key skills that are important for forming healthy relationships and also knowing how to recognize and avoid unhealthy relationships. Sam, again, mentioned some of this, but healthy marriage and relationship education programs are funded by the federal government through the Claims Resolution Act, and the funding is provided to communities in the form of discretionary grants, and there have been 3 cohorts since 2006, with the most recent cohort funded in 2015. And the federal HMRE programs focus on 8 key activities that are designed to promote healthy relationships and family strengthening. And here are the 8 activities, and in bold are the 2 activities that are the most specific for serving youth. This includes education in high schools and marriage and relationship education and skills more generally. And these specific activities do relate directly to the content of HMRE programming for youth. Among the 2011 cohort of OFA-funded HMRE programs, which will be the main focus of my presentation and the main focus of the study, the programs that served youth in high schools tended to focus on 3 key aspects: the value of marriage, relationship skills, and also budgeting, with a kind of financial literacy focus. And this ended up being quite a large focus for the 2011 cohort, since youth in high schools was actually the largest population served across the 2011 HMRE grantees. And to give you a more specific sense of what that looked like in numbers, approximately half of the 60 HMRE grantees that were funded in 2011 served youth ages 14 to 24, which is the age group for youth that we focus on in this study. And that translated to more than 40,000 youth that were reached between the 2011 and 2015 grant period. Although this is a large proportion of youth and of participants that were served through the federally funded programming, at that point, relatively little information was available about the programs that were working with youth. For example, limited information was available about the characteristics of the grantees themselves, the types of partners that they had to work with youth, and also the youth who participated in the programs. More information was also needed about the program implementation practices that were being used in these programs. For example, the extent to which the programming was informed by research and evaluation evidence for working with youth specifically. So OPRE designed and funded the Youth Education and Relationship Services project, or the YEARS project, to help to address these gaps in knowledge. The YEARS study had 3 specific objectives. First, to describe the organizations implementing federally funded HMRE programs for youth, and also the youth served in those programs. To assess whether HMRE programming for youth aligned with practices identified through research and evaluation to be optimal for serving youth, and we're calling these best practices. And third, to identify some promising approaches that were being used by grantees to better serve youth in their programs. To develop our best practices criteria, we drew on a number of existing resources. We drew from a logic model that Child Trends completed as part of another OPRE project, where we developed a kind of new forward-thinking logic model for youth serving HMRE programs. And we combined this with other federal reports on HMRE programming for youth and other published findings from research and evaluation on adolescent relationships and also positive youth development. And we incorporated this positive youth development framework, even though grantees were not necessarily explicitly integrating positive youth development approaches in their programming, but we considered elements of positive youth development as being critical for implementing best practices when working with youth. And based on this compilation of research and evaluation findings, we developed a set of specific criteria to then assess the alignment of HMRE programming practices with best practices for serving youth. And here's a summary of a number of the criteria that we identified, and they fell into 3 kind of overarching domains that included curriculum, staff attributes and skills, and organizational practices. And we'll look at some specific examples of each of these practices as we look at the results. And we really considered these criteria when we were developing our data analysis and data collection plans, and also our data collection instruments. And we drew from a number of different data sources, both quantitative and qualitative, for the project. We analyzed grantee performance data, also grantee applications, performance progress reports, and profiles that summarize the grantees' overall plans for how they would use the grant funding. And we also collected data through a web-based staff survey and program observations and staff interviews. The survey was completed by 26 directors and 8 facilitators from across 28 different grantees funded in 2011. And then we supported that survey with observations and staff interviews conducted with 9 grantees. And this was part of site visits. And at the site visits, we talked to program directors, program facilitators, and then also partners in the community that were working with the grantees. And although not part of the original design, we ended up talking to about half of grantees funded in 2011, and then the other half of the site visits were with grantees that were funded in 2011 and 2015, and a few funded new grantees funded in 2015, and that was really due to the timing of data collection. And I don't focus on those results here, but they are described in the report and started to give a little bit of an idea of some of the evolution of the grantees and some of the changing priorities for grantees working with youth. So I'm just going to review some of the key findings across our research objectives and then discuss some of the implications of the findings for HMRE programs serving youth. I'm going to focus mainly on objectives 1 and 2 just for the sake of time. And so just as a reminder, objective 1 was to describe the organizations that were implementing federally funded HMRE programs for youth and also the youth served in the programs. So we looked at program setting and found that grantees offered HMRE programs in a variety of settings, but primarily in community-based organizations or in schools during the school day. Other less common settings included after-school settings, clinics, and a few other types of locations were specified, and this included community centers, religious centers, and summer programs. We asked about a lot of different characteristics of the participants, and here we show the results for age of participants. And we were interested in the proportion of participants who were 14 to 17 years old, 18 to 24 years old, and then 25 and older, so the non-youth participants. Here we look at the percentage of grantees who report whether none, less than half, or more than half of their participants were in each category. And really the key takeaway from here is that no program reported that the majority of their participants were 18 to 24. So those 18 to 24-year-olds were more likely to be served along with younger youth or mixed in with adults ages 25 and older, which we saw as potentially a service gap for that older group of youth. Information about the types of youth targeted by the grantees was gathered from grantee profiles and also discussed during interviews with the grantee staff. And from that information, we learned that grantees targeted and served diverse and often disadvantaged populations of youth. And we have a number of examples on the slide here, just to highlight a few. We heard that programs were targeting youth with parents struggling with addiction, youth with incarcerated parents, impoverished youth, homeless youth, and pregnant and parenting youth. It's just some examples. We also explored different aspects of training in the programs. Here we're looking at findings for training related to program facilitation and delivery. And we found that training on program content, program delivery, and group facilitation were among the most common training topics. And also we heard that logic model and theory of change development training was common in establishing professional boundaries as well. What was interesting, though, is we also asked directors to report on areas where they felt that their facilitators needed more training. And so here, although program directors reported that most or all of their facilitators had received at least some training in the areas I just mentioned, the directors did report that facilitators needed more training in areas like logic model and theory of change development and group facilitation. So that was a brief look at just a few of the key characteristics of youth serving HMRE programs and their participants. The final report definitely includes a lot more information, but I just wanted to highlight a few kind of descriptive findings. And then turn to our second objective, where we assess whether HMRE programming for youth aligned with our research-based best practices. And again, these best practices were drawn from a review of published and unpublished research and evaluation studies that assess key components of HMRE programming and also key components of positive youth development approaches for working with youth. And here, the key finding for this objective was that the vast majority of grantees, so over 80%, agreed that their organizations were implementing a range of best practices for serving youth. These reports were consistent across directors and facilitators, and also across the survey and interviews and the observations as well. And we'll look at a few examples of those best practices in the next few slides. For example, here we see that nearly all directors agreed or strongly agreed that their programs had clear goals, logical sequencing of program content and activities, and included sharing and listening activities. You can see similar high percentages here where most grantees reported practices that fostered positive youth interactions, including targeting specific needs of the youth served and valuing diverse relationships and family backgrounds. We wanted to explore the topic of inclusivity more during the staff interviews. And during the interviews, grantee staff described different approaches that they used to make sure their programming was culturally appropriate and relevant for their youth populations. Some examples described during the interviews included hiring staff with similar racial and ethnic backgrounds as the youth served, using research-based approaches for serving youth, and also curriculum that were developed specifically for their youth populations in their community. And programs were also incorporating relevant content. An example of this was among programs that were working with pregnant and parenting youth. They had incorporated some co-parenting lessons into their program. And I am going to skip over the Objective 3 findings and jump to our conclusions. Again, the study really was intended to inform ACF, but also the broader HMRE research and practice fields about youth serving HMRE programs. And drawing on key findings from each research objective, the report includes a number of recommendations for supporting the design and implementation of HMRE programs for youth. And for today's presentation, I'm focusing on some of the key recommendations that related most to staff training to kind of continue that conversation. Overall, we found that 2011 HMRE grantees were quite thoughtful in their selection of curriculum, in their recruitment and retention strategies when working with youth, and also their implementation practices. Although many of the grantees had tailored their programs to better meet the needs of their youth served and were already implementing practices that we had identified through research and to be optimal for serving youth, we do feel like grantees could benefit from even more ongoing education and training related to, for example, the unique needs of youth in their communities in particular, so really understanding the populations and families in their immediate communities. Some more training on selecting curricula that are age and developmentally appropriate, and best practices for serving youth more generally. And again, we think that this is particularly important for programs that are serving a mix of youth and adults, which was fairly common, and especially thinking about that older group of older youth, the 18 to 24-year-olds. And some other specific program implementation areas that we identified for additional training included integrating some of those positive youth development approaches, such as providing skill building opportunities, providing youth with leadership opportunities, and also including youth in decision-making about the programs. And finally, conducting observations on an ongoing basis to help to monitor program and curriculum fidelity and quality as part of ongoing program improvement efforts. Because we didn't talk about Objective 3, I didn't cover this, but one of the findings there is that only about half of the grantees had reported that they had conducted observations to monitor program fidelity and quality. So this was an example of one of the organizational practices that we looked at and where we found that fewer grantees were really doing that practice and thought that more training would be useful. The final report for the year's project is on the OPRE project webpage, and there's also fact sheet that is available that we developed early in the project that provides some descriptive information about youth serving programs. And just to give one more plug, that's the cover page for the report. Okay, thanks.
It's this button. Yep. Great. All right, I'll get started. Again, I'm Julia Alamillo from Mathematica Policy Research. Today, I'll be presenting on promoting healthy relationships in high schools, implementation findings from the STREAMS evaluation. And before I get started, I would like to thank my co-authors on this work, Scott Baumgardner and Heather Saveri, and also Sam, who is our project officer on STREAMS. Okay. So I'll begin with some background on the STREAMS evaluation. Then I'll describe the design of one program in the evaluation that's providing relationship education to youth in high schools. Next, I'll present some data on how these services were delivered during the 2016-2017 school year. After that, I'll move on to a description of students' characteristics and their engagement in the program. And finally, I'll summarize the key findings related to program implementation. STREAMS, which stands for Strengthening Relationship Education and Marriage Services, includes 5 separate random assignment evaluations of healthy marriage and relationship education programs funded by the Office of Family Assistance in 2015. For each of these 5 programs, Mathematica, along with its partner Public Strategies, is conducting both an impact study and a process study. The focus on STREAMS broadly is on understudied populations and program approaches not included in prior federal evaluations of HMRE programs, including programs for youth. So as Mindy already alluded to, since 2010, more than half of grantees receiving HMRE funding from OFA have offered relationship education to youth, but until STREAMS, none of these programs has been included in a federal evaluation. My presentation today focuses on one STREAMS site that's delivering the Relationship Smarts Plus 3.0 curriculum in high schools. And to learn about the implementation of this program, we collected data from several sources, including program observations, interviews and surveys with program staff, focus groups and surveys with program participants, and a client management information system known as NFORM. So the grantee that I'm going to be talking about today is an organization called More Than Conquerors Incorporated, or MTCI for short. MTCI is a nonprofit social service provider serving at-risk families and youth in the Atlanta area. They're an experienced grantee, having received 2 prior rounds of grant funding from OFA, once in 2006 and again in 2011, to deliver HMRE programming to high school students. They're using the 2015 round of grant funding to deliver Relationship Smarts Plus in high schools and community-based settings. And the STREAMS evaluation is specifically focused on their delivery of the curriculum in 2 high schools in Gwinnett County, Georgia, which is located just northeast of Atlanta. The evaluation compares the impact of 2 different versions of Relationship Smarts Plus to a control curriculum which focuses on job readiness. Relationship Smarts Plus is a very widely used relationship education curriculum designed for youth ages 13 through 18. It consists of 12 90-minute lessons covering 6 different content areas, which I'll go over in some more detail on the next slide. The way it works is facilitators use slides prepared by the curriculum developer to present core content in a lecture-style format. The lessons also include lots of interactive activities and small group work to elicit discussion. Students are given a workbook, which they use to complete both in-class and homework assignments. And in addition, the curriculum includes several parent-teen connection activities, which are basically discussion prompts designed to start conversations between students and their parents or another trusted adult. So for STREAMS, MTCI actually tested 2 different versions of Relationship Smarts Plus. They wanted to learn whether a shortened version of the curriculum could be as effective as a full version. So as I said before, the full version contains 12 lessons in these 6 different content areas. So they are self-awareness, healthy relationships, dangerous relationships, communication and conflict, intimacy and sexual decisions, and social media. To develop the shortened, or what we've been referring to as the summary version of the curriculum, MTCI worked closely with the distributor of Relationship Smarts Plus, the Dibble Institute, to decide on what to cut. Rather than delivering condensed versions of all 12 lessons, they decided to entirely exclude 4 lessons in 2 different content areas, communication and conflict and intimacy and sexual decisions. MTCI felt that cutting 4 full lessons was preferable to delivering shortened versions of 12 lessons because it meant youth in the summary group would cover the selected 8 lessons in the same level of depth as youth in the full group. And in addition, cutting the lessons made it easier for MTCI to train their facilitators and to maintain and monitor fidelity. So instead of these lessons, students in the summary group received 4 lessons from a job readiness curriculum, and youth in the control group received all 12 lessons from a job readiness curriculum. Facilitators delivered lessons to students in health classes during the regular school day. At both of these schools, health was a requirement for 9th graders. Both schools used block scheduling with 90-minute class periods, which allowed facilitators, at least for the most part, to complete each lesson in a single class period. And lessons were taught weekly by 1 or 2 facilitators, and each school had 9 classes in the streams evaluation each semester, divided equally among the full, summary, and control groups. Since this presentation is about the implementation of Relationship Smarts Plus, in the next few slides, I'm going to describe only the full and summary groups and ignore the control group, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the control group during the Q&A. All right, so this graph shows facilitators' reports of how often they use the curriculum materials and manual, both in the full and summary groups. As you can see, adherence to the curriculum was quite high. In the full group, facilitators indicated that they used curriculum materials in 87% of class sessions and that they followed all of the curriculum as written in the instructor's manual in 92% of class sessions. And these percentages were even higher in the summary group, with facilitators indicating they used all of the curriculum materials in 98% of class sessions and that they adhered to all of the manual in 94% of class sessions. One thing we learned from interviews with program staff is that MTCI had a very thorough process in place for training and supervising their facilitators. For instance, supervisors and the program director conducted frequent unannounced classroom observations to ensure that facilitators delivered the program with fidelity. And the results shown here indicate that they achieved this goal. Okay. Turning now to participant characteristics, this table presents descriptive information from the baseline survey for students that enrolled in streams during the 2016-2017 school year. And one of the main takeaways from this table is that the majority of students identified as Hispanic, and a large portion, 44%, spoke primarily Spanish at home. Although Gwinnett County as a whole is only about 20% Hispanic, these schools drew from disproportionately low-income Hispanic areas within the county. And as you can also see from this table, the vast majority of students were in 9th grade, and about half were female. In addition, about a quarter of students were Black, only a small percentage were white, and finally, only around a fifth of students indicated that their biological parents were currently married. All right. This figure also presents data from the baseline student survey and shows that students reported a variety of relationship experiences. Specifically, 69% said that they were currently not in a romantic relationship, 17% said that they were casually dating someone, and 14% said that they were seriously dating someone. We also found that few students reported attending a class on HMRE topics before high school. So in the year prior to the study, only 25% of students reported attending a class on romantic relationships or dating, and only 31% reported attending a class on teen pregnancy or STIs. And even smaller percentages of students reported attending a class on dating, violence, or marriage. Okay, turning now to program engagement, we found that in the first year of the study, most youth attended all or nearly all of the 12 class sessions. In fact, only 8% of youth in both the full and summary groups reported or attended 6 or fewer sessions. This likely reflects the fact that the program was delivered to students in a required class during the regular school day. In general, we know from prior studies that attendance tends to be much higher in programs that serve students during school as opposed to after school or in another community-based setting. Given these high levels of attendance, it's not surprising that youth received most of the intended Relationship Smarts Plus content. In the full group, the curriculum was 18 hours long, so again, 12 90-minute class sessions, and on average, youth received 15.4 hours. And in the summary group, where the curriculum was 12 hours long, youth received an average of 10.6 curriculum hours. Finally, interviews and surveys with MTCI staff and focus groups with MTCI participants indicated that youth were highly engaged in the Relationship Smarts Plus lessons. Overall, facilitators reported that most or all youth engaged in nearly all of the class sessions. Students reported enjoying how interactive the lessons were, as opposed to their regular classes, which contained lots of lectures and boring individual assignments. Students also liked that the lessons didn't require being in a romantic relationship. So the things that they learned, for instance, related to communication or healthy relationships, applied to friendships and peers as well as to romantic partners. So as one program participant stated, the program changed how I think about not just romantic relationships, but platonic. Just like I'm more respectful of my friends and how they feel and their personal boundaries, and I'm more willing to work on my studies at school. So to conclude, MTCI worked closely with the curriculum distributor to create a summary version of Relationship Smarts Plus that differed from the full version. Specifically, the summary version excluded lessons on communication and sexual decisions. MTCI's facilitators implemented the curriculum with a great degree of fidelity, maintaining the intended differences between the full and summary versions. And finally, students demonstrated high attendance and appeared actively engaged in the program. In addition, in our conversations with students, they reported learning new skills and a better understanding of what constitutes a healthy relationship. So for more information, you can feel free to reach out to me or my colleagues Scott or Heather. You can also keep an eye out for the process study report, which this presentation is based on, which is currently under review and should be released shortly, and the impact study report, which is still a couple of years away. We're actually now in the midst of collecting follow-up data from students to include in that report. So that's all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Paulsell, also from Mathematica. Do I need to click on something? Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about a project called Self-Regulation, Training Approaches and Resources to Improve Staff Capacity for Implementing Healthy Marriage Programs for Youth. And that's quite a mouthful, so we call the project SARM for short. The project started in fall 2017. It's funded by ACF, and it's being led by Public Strategies along with Mathematica Policy Research. There we go. So this is an overview of what I'm going to present today. I'll give you some background and motivation for the project, and then I'll talk about the work we're doing, the ACF grantees that are partnering with us, and our methodology for developing and refining the training approaches and also measures. So SARM's primary objective is to develop and test training approaches and resources for supporting adolescent and young adult self-regulation skill development in the context of HMRE programs. So we've already heard some today about what these programs are like, but I want to review just a few key characteristics. The current cohort of grantees was funded in 2015. There are about 30 that provide services primarily to youth and young adults ages 14 to 24. Like years, that's also the target age range for our study. And these programs provide youth with information and skills to help them develop healthy romantic relationships and avoid unhealthy relationship experiences. As has been described, they typically use a standardized curriculum that is delivered in group workshops. They include a mix of lectures and interactive activities. They are delivered usually in about 10 to 12 sessions, and they're delivered in high school classes such as the MTCI example, health, or sometimes family and consumer sciences classes. They're also delivered in community-based settings. And in community-based programs, they often deliver case management individually to the youth in addition to the groups. So that's HMRE programs. Now let me tell you a little bit about self-regulation. So self-regulation is conceptualized as the three overlapping domains of cognitive, emotional, and behavior regulation. So it really serves as a foundation for lifelong functioning across a wide range of domains: educational attainment, employment, family and romantic relationships, parenting, and so on. So it's really important. Something that can be confusing about the term self-regulation is that there are just so many different terms which sound kind of like the same thing. So one distinction that we make is that we see self-regulation as an umbrella, the broadest construct that includes different cognitive and emotional aspects of self-regulation that people in different disciplines have defined in a variety of ways. So with this in mind, you can see how HMRE programs, with their focus on things like setting goals for the future, communication skills, managing conflict and breakups, managing emotions, etc., are just a great context in which to work on developing capacity for self-regulation. And this slide shows the three domains that I mentioned: emotion, cognitive, and behavior regulation, and some of the skills in each domain that are typically targeted by HMRE programs. So I have one more term to introduce. Co-regulation is the supportive process between caring adults and children and youth that fosters self-regulation development. So the term caring adults is used to describe any adult who provides care and support to a child, a youth, a young adult. This could include parents, guardians, teachers, coaches, youth group leaders, mentors. But regardless of their role, the caregiver's warmth, responsiveness, and sensitivity is thought to support self-regulation development and may buffer the effects of adverse childhood experiences. So effective co-regulation by a supportive caregiver will promote self-efficacy and allow the youth to feel secure enough to practice new skills and learn from mistakes. And there are three broad categories of self-regulation support that caring adults can provide. So first is the warm, responsive relationship, and especially providing that caring support in times of stress. The second is collaboratively structuring the environment to make self-regulation manageable, providing a buffer against environmental stressors. So this means creating an environment that is physically and emotionally safe for youth to explore and learn at their level of development without serious risk to their well-being. Consistent, predictable routines and expectations are also important for this. And then the third area is coaching, modeling, and reinforcing self-regulation skills. This could be through instruction, opportunities for practice, prompts for skill enactment, and reinforcement of each of the steps towards successful use of the skills. So you could think of it like a coach on a sports team. Caregivers first need to teach the skills and then provide needed supports or scaffolding for self-regulation enactment in the moment. All these on here. Okay. So this work is building on a large and comprehensive literature review that was conducted for ACF by Dr. Desiree Murray and her colleagues that culminated in a series of reports and briefs on self-regulation and toxic stress. And if you're interested in learning more about this topic, this series is absolutely terrific, and you can find all the publications on OPRE's website. So the graph down there on the right of the screen shows the number of studies that the team found for different developmental groups. The peak there is for elementary age children. There's also a fair number of studies on middle schoolers, but then there are very few for high school students and young adults. So this is an important motivation for SARM to contribute to building the evidence base on how to support self-regulation. In other words, to really do co-regulation with this age group. All right, so with that background in mind, I'm going to turn now to describe what we're doing on the SARM project. So we started with a literature review on adolescent and young adult self-regulation and co-regulation strategies that focused on studies not captured by the brief series. We reviewed HMRE programs and curricula for youth, including taking a careful look at the years study, and we reviewed measures of self and co-regulation. And as I said at the beginning, SARM is developing training approaches for staff in these HMRE programs to help them learn how to support youth self-regulation, to help them learn how to co-regulate. So we're not changing any of the content delivered to youth. Instead, we're aiming to equip the facilitators to support youth self-regulation skill development as they're working together on the HMRE content. So the second part of our project is to develop those training approaches and materials. We're going to be conducting formative rapid cycle testing of the approach with 2 HMRE program partners, and we're also going to be conducting a limited field test of co-regulation measures developed as part of the project. And our formative rapid cycle testing is what we call a road test of the strategies. So we developed our road test plan based on the Learn, Innovate, and Improve, or LI squared process that's been developed by some of our colleagues at Mathematica. I'm going to give you a really quick introduction to that, but there is a session tomorrow on LI squared, and if you're interested in the process, I highly recommend that session. But in a nutshell, the road test is an interactive prototyping process in which we'll work with a selected group of HMRE program educators who are delivering services to groups of youth. They will receive the training that we develop, they'll try out the new co-regulation strategies, and they'll provide us with targeted feedback about how it went. And we're going to do what we call 3 learning cycles of this road test. So as I said, we'll do the initial training. Staff will try out the strategies and provide feedback during each of what we're referring to as learning cycles. So the staff are going to do a pre-post test around the training. They'll complete short surveys after the program sessions to provide feedback. We'll observe some of the sessions, and we'll also do interviews with the staff and focus groups with the youth to get their input. So we'll analyze that data, present it to our program partners, and together we'll make decisions about improvements and possibly additions to the training, and then we'll try it again. And we'll go through that process a total of 3 times. So the program staff actually play a very critical role as our partners in developing the training content. We have 2 partners. They're very different, which gives us a chance to see how these training approaches work in different settings and with different populations of youth. So Children's Harbor in Pembroke Pines, Florida, operates a program called True North for youth ages 18 to 23 who are aging out of foster care. So this is a pretty high need group of youth. They provide a series of group workshops on relationship education using a curriculum called Love Notes. And they also provide a few sessions on financial literacy and employment. And they have navigators and financial coaches that do individual case management meetings with the youth on top of the group sessions. Our other partner is MTCI, which you already heard about. For this project, we're going to be working with them on HMRE services delivered to 9th graders in 4 high schools. So I think the 2 streams high schools and 2 others as well. And as Julia said, they deliver Relationship Smarts Plus during health class. It goes over 12 weeks, and in these high schools, it's either a 60 or a 90-minute class period. So as a first step to launching the field test, we have developed a menu of training approaches for the staff to consider, and these are just a few examples. The menu has 5 categories of approaches. The first is workplace strategies for staff. And this is to help staff learn about self and co-regulation and practice the skills among themselves and in their own lives. And we see this as really foundational for their work with the youth. An example of this would be doing regular mindfulness or focusing exercises during their staff meetings. We have identified a set of evidence-based kernels. These are very small, specific actions that have evidence of effectiveness. An example would be giving positive verbal or written praise. And then the other 3 categories of strategies align with the 3 domains of co-regulation: skills coaching, the environment, and relationships. So we have we have held what we call strategic planning meetings with each partner, in which we provided information about self and co-regulation. We reviewed their program context and target population, and we reviewed the menu of training approaches with them and went through a process of together selecting the approaches that they wanted to use in the road test. The product of these meetings is what we call a roadmap for each program to kind of guide the road test work that we're going to be doing with them. So the strategies are the training approaches that we selected to kind of match up with their population of youth and their program context. We identified targets, or the changes that they want to see in themselves and the youth as a result of the training, and we identified some target outcomes. We also spent time talking about moderators. In other words, what might support or get in the way of implementing these strategies. So we're in the process right now of building out the selected training approaches in consultation with an expert panel. We're going to launch the road tests in July and August, and then we're also going to conduct a limited field test of measures that we're using in the road test: an educator questionnaire, a session assessment form, and a session observation tool. And I didn't have time to talk about the field test, but I'd be happy to answer questions about that. We're hoping to be reporting out on this work in about fall 2019. Ultimately, our aim is to develop and refine training approaches that could be ready for more rigorous evaluation, and then eventually taken up and used by these youth-serving OFA grantees. And similarly, our goal for the measures work is that we can create measures that would be ready for perhaps a more rigorous field test, perhaps for use in a future evaluation, and eventually to be taken up and used by grantees alongside the training approaches that we've developed. So I want to end by acknowledging our SARM team. Our project director is Ali Fry. Our project officers at OPRE are Alita Meyer and Karen Blitz. Thank you.
Thanks very much to our 3 fantastic speakers. I wanted to open up the floor for any questions from anyone in our audience here or in the live stream. And I think there's a mic set up so that people on the live stream can hear you right there. Up.
All right, so first, thank you all. This has been really interesting. So I just had a couple of questions. So one, just in regards to the MTCI program. So I understand it's a program that's located in Atlanta. From what I know, as far as many of the peers I have in Atlanta, many of the relatives I've had in Atlanta, in the African American community in particular, there's a, from what I know, there's a large non-heterosexual population there, and that got me to thinking about whether one, well, I guess whether there was a need or any effort to adapt healthy marriage programs for non-heterosexual youth couples. And my second question was about the social media content of the curriculum. Now, when I grew up, Facebook was just about all there was, and the only implication it had as far as relationships was the relationship status identification. That has changed dramatically. Now social media plays such a prominent role, I think, in youth relationships, and I don't know if we fully understand some of the norms around social media in regards to relationship and how that impacts youth and what implications that has for healthy relationships. So I was curious to know what the social media content looked like and what it focused on. And that was my second question. I can repeat either of them if you need me to.
Yeah, I think I got it. Thank you. Right. So to address your first question, yes, there has been an element of adaptation to the curriculum and just awareness around non-heterosexual couples. It's definitely something that MTCI is aware of in their program, and that, on streams we've thought about quite a bit. And the curriculum developer actually worked with MTCI to make some adaptations to the curriculum, include just some examples of homosexual couples or non-normative gender identities throughout the curriculum to really make sure that it wasn't targeted to only heterosexual couples. So it's definitely an issue at the forefront of their minds. And then to your second question about social media, I don't have a great sense of how current that chapter of the curriculum is. I mean, I know that the curriculum itself is something that is constantly being updated. The developer is, tries her best to kind of stay on top of it and meet with youth and update the curriculum. I mean, social media is something that's changing so rapidly. I would wonder how the youth in the program, whether they see it as reflective of their experiences or, something that their parents on Facebook use or something. So I'm not entirely sure, but again, I think it's something that we're hoping to address further in our future studies, trying to think more about the role that social media plays in relationships. I think it's a really important topic for these youth-serving relationship programs in general.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I think that's something that we were interested in exploring in the year study as well, and other projects too, where social media, thinking about social media as a very important element of youth relationships, but also as a tool for implementing programs with youth. And there's a little bit of discussion of that in the report. I felt like the programs were just sort of starting to think about the content of the program and how social media needed to be more of a focus. And then also, but we did see that programs were using social media as a tool for recruitment, to kind of keep youth engaged. So there were a few specific examples of using social media as part of implementation practices.
Sorry. Hello. I have a question. So I saw the curriculum have two components. Was eliminated for the was that revised? How that decision was made? Like, which component to be eliminated, and what's the impact of that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I think there is a curriculum. You have 12,
Yep.
12 hours or something.
Yeah, 12 lessons. Yep.
But for the you have another version of the curriculum that's two components were eliminated, right?
Yep.
So how that decision was made and why that two components were eliminated and what's the impact of that?
So we don't know the impact yet. We are planning to do an impact analysis once we've finished collecting follow-up data. So follow-up data collection will wrap up in about May of this coming year, May 2019. But in terms of the decision process for cutting those 4 lessons, so MTCI in their original grant proposal, I believe, wanted to understand the effects of a shortened version of their curriculum, just recognizing that often time constraints are a big issue when you go into schools and want to deliver a curriculum. Schools often push back on the amount of time it will take, and so MTCI wanted to be thoughtful about that and think about testing a shortened version. And so they worked very closely with the curriculum distributor and developer to decide how to shorten that curriculum. And sort of the 2 options they were debating were just cutting pieces of each lesson, so trying to do all 12 lessons but a condensed version, or what they ultimately decided was to eliminate 4 lessons. And so 2 lessons around communication skills and 2 lessons around sexual decision-making and intimacy. I think part of that decision, like I mentioned earlier, was it made it easier to, just sort of have the curriculum and tell the facilitators to just skip over these 4 lessons, as opposed to maybe leaving it more up to the discretion of the facilitator to try and condense certain portions of all of the lessons. And so the developer actually gave them adapted workbooks that eliminated all the workbook pages for those 4 lessons, and so we'll see if there is an impact soon.
Thank you.
Diane mentioned, Diane mentioned that co-regulators who provide warm, sensitive care, especially in times of stress, may help buffer the effects of ACEs. Is there any data to show the impact of co-regulator activities and the reduction of feelings of trauma among youth?
I would refer the questioner to the Self-Regulation and Toxic Stress series. You should be able to find that on the OPRE website. I think that has a lot of information on that topic, and I think the literature review goes up to 2015, so it's pretty current, and it covers from birth through young adulthood, so it's pretty comprehensive. In terms of the SAROM project, I think there's a limited time here, right, to make a difference. If you're talking about 12 90-minute sessions, I think there's a limit to the effect that it can have, but we still think that it's important to provide this co-regulation in that setting and help youth move forward with their self-regulation skills.
How's that? If it doesn't fall out. Good morning. I'm Rebecca Oder, and I'm in the Administration for Children and Families, and I work in domestic violence, specifically teen dating violence and healthy relationships also. So when I see what we've learned in there is a lot of the prevention program that we're doing in the schools, we find that there's a lot of disclosures of unhealthy, or in your curriculum, Julie, was dangerous relationships. There's a lot of those disclosures, and I wanted to see what type of partnerships and collaborations you all have made with the local programs serving those communities around teen dating violence.
That's a great question. And I have no doubt that MTCI has partnerships in place. They've been serving families in these communities and youth in these communities for so many years, but I don't know specifically about the partnerships that they have in those communities. But I know in one of our other stream sites, which we didn't end up moving forward with, this was a major issue in the Chicago Public Schools. It was one of the main questions that they had when the program there wanted to implement the same curriculum actually with high schoolers in their schools, was this issue of reporting dangerous relationships, and they had a very robust partnership network in the area for referring students, for how to respond if a student brings that up. Again, it's a really important issue with both youth and adult couples, but obviously with the mandatory reporting aspect, it becomes an even bigger issue, I think, in these youth programs.
So thanks for that question, Becky. It's a really important one, and I'll just comment that MTCI actually happens to be a participant at one of the sites in another OPRE-led study called the River Project. And the River Project is actually specifically looking at what these healthy marriage and relationships education programs, both for adults but for youth as well, are doing around partnering with domestic violence programs in their local communities, and kind of what processes and practices they have in place and how those can be strengthened. And for the River study, we're currently doing a field test with MTCI is one of the youth sites to test out different approaches to screening for, and then kind of following through with a process to address disclosures that might happen in the context of these programs. I believe that for the River Project, we're working with the other two high schools that aren't involved in streams, so that they will be involved with the Sarum Project. You can see, we spoke about how MTCI has been doing this work for a lot of years, and as such, they're a very strong organization that is really committed to working with us to do research, which we really appreciate, and they've been great partners in this in the River Project, so we should be learning a little bit more about kind of the approaches that work best to address disclosure of IPV, or teen dating violence rather, in these youth programs. But to participate in the project, that project is being led by RTI, and they've really worked closely with MTCI and the domestic violence organization in the community to make sure that there is a strong kind of process and partnership there. They were all trained as part of the River study to work together, but they already had that process in place. So that's just one example, but ACF, or rather OFA, the Office of Family Assistance that administers the HMRE grants, there is a requirement in the funding opportunity announcement for these grants to have a partnership with domestic violence agencies in the community. So all of the grantees should be developing those partnerships. I think we know from our work that there's kind of different levels of what those partnerships look like, but that's something we're really thinking about a lot.
And I can tell you in Children's Harbor, the other Sarum site, the youth that are aging out of foster care have a lot of other wraparound services. They each have a therapist, they have a life coach. So there are lots of opportunities for the HMRE program to reach out to those other providers when disclosures are made.
Are there any other questions from the room or live stream? No? Okay. Well, I think then we can wrap up. Thanks so much for attending, and thanks again to our speakers. And we hope you attend some of the other related sessions that were mentioned here, the PACT plenary that's happening tomorrow, also related to some healthy marriage findings, should be really interesting for this audience. So thanks a lot.